Reality Transurfing, Book 3, Forward to the Past, by Vadim Zeland. Chapter 6, Conclusion, Strange Reality. Based on the model of variations, I provide explanations to several paranormal phenomena and strange time and space phenomena. Strange reality. In conclusion, I would like to strengthen the ground under the mind's feet just a little bit more. Alas, there is so much incredible in transurfing that one has to keep explaining to the mind that it's all actually real. Regardless of what model transurfing is based on, its principles remain in force. In other words, all these principles are invariant in regards to the model. Let me repeat that. In other words, all these principles are invariant in regards to the model. And the main principle is that the radiation of our thoughts doesn't only have an indirect but also a direct effect on the reality surrounding us. Formal science still refuses to accept this fact, as experimental testing yields ambiguous results. But you and I need to solve our problems now, and not wait until the scientists will have their weighty say. We are all used to that our world obeys the laws of causality, where every effect has its cause. By cause, we usually understand some kind of action, but the actual thoughts of a person are typically perceived only as a guide to his subsequent actions, and not as a material radiation capable of influencing the world around us. And nevertheless, facts are a stubborn thing. Unexplained manifestations of active external intention could not have been completely ignored by science. The famous Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung investigated phenomena connected to the interaction of thoughts and material reality. He has analyzed hundreds of strange cases, which appeared as incomprehensible coincidences, not determined by any obvious causes. Jung defined such coincidences as synchronicity. In his lecture on synchronicity, Jung cites one classic example from his practice. In quotations. On April 1st, 1949, I made a note in the morning of an inscription containing a figure that was half man and half fish. There was fish for lunch. Somebody mentioned the custom of making an April fish of someone. In the afternoon, a former patient of mine, whom I had not seen for months, showed me some impressive pictures of fish. In the evening, I was shown a piece of embroidery with sea monsters and fishes in it. The next morning, I saw a former patient who was visiting me for the first time in 10 years. She had dreamed of a large fish the night before. A few months later, when I was using this series for larger work and had just finished writing it down, I walked to a spot by the lake in front of the house where I had already been several times that morning. This time a fish, a foot long, lay on the seawall. Since no one else was present, I have no idea how the fish could have got there. I can't resist citing another extract from Jung's lecture. Why, you will find out later. He writes, in quotations, I could tell you a great many such stories, which are in principle no more surprising or incredible than the irrefutable results arrived at by Rhine, with reference to the experiments involving extrasensory perception, for example, card guessing, author's note, end parentheses. And you would soon see that almost every case calls for its own explanation. But the causal explanation, the only possible one from the standpoint of natural science, breaks down to the psychic relativization of space and time, which together form the indispensable premises for the cause and effect relationship. My example concerned a young woman patient who, in spite of efforts made on both sides proved to be psychologically inaccessible. The difficulty lay in the fact that she always knew better about everything. Her excellent education had provided her with a weapon ideally suited to this purpose, namely a highly polished Cartesian rationalism with an impeccably geometrical idea of reality. After several fruitless attempts to sweeten her rationalism with a somewhat more human understanding, I had to confine myself to the hope that something unexpected and irrational would turn up, something that would burst the intellectual retort into which she had sealed herself. Well, I was sitting opposite her one day with my back to the window, listening to her flow of rhetoric. She had had an impressive dream the night before, in which someone had given her a golden scarab, a costly piece of jewelry. While she was still telling me this dream, I heard something behind me, gently tapping on the window. I turned round and saw that it was a fairly large flying insect that was knocking against the window pane from outside in an obvious effort to get into the dark room. This seemed to me very strange. I opened the window immediately and caught the creature in the air as it flew in. It was a scarabide beetle, or common rosechafer, Cetonia irata, whose gold-green color most resembles that of the golden scarab. I handed the beetle to my patient with the words, "Here is your golden scarab." This experience punctured the desired hole in her rationalism and broke the ice of her intellectual resistance. The treatment could now be continued with satisfactory results. So about a half an hour after thinking about Jung's beetle and considering whether I should include it as an example, into my window flew a wanderer of rather impressive appearance. It was a beetle resembling the one mentioned above. I have to admit that, although such visits are extremely rare, I wasn't at all surprised, but not because I am used to reacting calmly to synchronicity phenomena. On the contrary, absorbed in my own thoughts, I didn't attach any importance to it at all. I automatically let the beetle out the open window pane so that the insect didn't have to look for it, and only once some time had passed, I got terrified. God, what an idiot I am! As many times as external intention announces its presence, just as many times I opened my eyes wide in amazement. You see, I was actually sleeping soundly awake, as they were tugging me to show me a sign. If I were superstitious, I would have thought it to be a sign from above. You can imagine how people are always sleeping awake, not noticing the obvious manifestations of external intention. There are plenty more examples like this. From the standpoint of transurfing, the situation here is pretty clear. In isolated cases, visualization gives rise to a strong blast of wind of external intention. But Jung is in no hurry to make a final conclusion on what actually caused these coincidences, whether thoughts form events or whether thoughts occur as a result of an unconscious foreknowledge of events. On the other hand, Jung says that thoughts have formed the basis for the series of chance events. But on the other hand, it is sometimes difficult to avoid the impression that there is a sort of foreknowledge of the coming series of events. In his work Synchronicity and a Causal Connecting Principle, 1960, Jung defined synchronicity as the simultaneous occurrence of a certain psychic state with one or more external events which appear as meaningful parallels to the momentary subjective state. Jung hesitated for a long time to publish his work because the synchronicity phenomenon is inconceivable to traditional scientific thinking. Jung makes a vague but rather bold, according to the standards of traditional science, conclusion. Synchronistic phenomena prove the simultaneous occurrence of meaningful equivalences in heterogeneous, causally unrelated processes. In other words, they prove that a content perceived by an observer can, and at the same time, be represented by an outside event, without any causal connection. From this it follows either that the psyche cannot be localized in space, or that space is relative to the psyche. Evidently, there is no violation of the law of causality. The cause is always there. It is just that the mechanism of interaction of thoughts and the surroundings is manifested in an unclear and so far incomprehensible way. Then what causes synchronistic coincidences? Are events shaped by thoughts, or do they actually appear as a premonition of events? From the standpoint of transurfing, both things take place. The soul gets access to the data stored in the field of information, which can then be interpreted by the mind. The mind, in its turn, shapes thoughts, which, in the presence of unity between the soul and mind, can be manifested into material reality. These tenets are what transurfing is based on. But I emphasize once again that the model of variations disclaims an accurate description of the world. Instead, it serves only as a benchmark, a basis for understanding of the principles. We still know too little about this world, but that doesn't stop us from applying the principles of transurfing, and that they work is up to you to find out. All phenomena related to the effect of thought energy on the surrounding world could be justified by the famous quantum physics theorem of John Bell, which goes like this. There are no isolated systems. Every particle in the universe is an instantaneous, faster than the speed of light communication with every other particle. The entire system, even if its parts are separated by huge distances, functions as a whole system. This theorem has been proved theoretically and has already found practical confirmation, although instantaneous communication conflicts with a certain relativity theory, which claims that energy cannot spread faster than light. Nonetheless, the theorem has a place. Turns out, external intention doesn't conform to the theory of relativity. Actually, quantum physics is based on improvable postulates. That means that quantum physics, too, represents a specific model, and there is not one incomprehensible contradiction, but a whole lot of them. This once again confirms that you shouldn't attach too much significance to a model, and I must note that Jung's ideas have found support in actual founders of modern physics, Wolfgang Pauli and Albert Einstein, though it is very likely that the process of information exchange doesn't have anything to do with energy at all, and that is why it could happen faster than the speed of light. You can find contradictions in the model of variations too, but it nonetheless explains quite a few things. The model of variations, if not eliminates, then at very least somewhat smooths out some known paradoxes of space and time. Until now, we have been examining the transference onto other life tracks in sync with time. Life tracks have always been parallel to the time axis. In other words, the transfer has always been made from one point in time to the very same point in time. Now, imagine two life tracks that are not parallel to the time axis. Projections of one and the same point of these tracks onto the time axis will lie in different places. A transfer between these tracks means moving in time, to the past or the future, depending on the direction of the slope. The relative steepness of the slope is determined by the remoteness of the transfer in time. By analogy, if two life tracks are not parallel to the chosen space axis, a transfer between them will entail an instant or inconceivably quick transfer in space. Steepness and direction of the slope of the tracks is determined by the level of remoteness and the direction of the transfer. This is a rather basic explanation, but it is quite acceptable for our understanding. The meticulous reader may object, well, and what about the paradox of disruption and the cause and effect relationships when traveling in time? Let's suppose I go to the past, to a time before I was born, and there I brutally murdered my parents. Then how did I come into this world? The given paradox within the framework of the model of variations only appears to be such. Indeed, on that life track, I cannot get born. So what? After all, I was born on another life track. I'll remind you that there are an infinite number of life tracks, variations, where I exist and where I do not. The most bloodthirsty paradox lover could even go back to his childhood, meet himself there, and settle with the innocent creature. However, in this case, he won't meet himself, but a realization of his separate variation, which exists along with all kinds of other variations. You really cannot change the past. It has already happened, but it happened not only because a past section of a life track was realized, but because the variations of past events were already in existence. Thus, causal links are not disrupted when you move from one life track to another. You could take a roll of film and cross over one frame, but that won't change the subsequent frames. Time is static. Only the realization of variations on a life track is subject to dynamic change. Let me repeat that. Only the realization of variations on a life track is subject to dynamic change. In exactly the same way, the spot of light from a flashlight is moving across the trees in a dark forest. What is actually impossible to do is to travel to the past or to the future on one and the same life track. Paradoxes actually take place only in this situation. Isn't this why the predictions of clairvoyants are quite approximate and often wrong? Clairvoyants are able to, in a way, scan the fragments of the future. If the scanned fragments are on other life tracks, then the errors in predictions are easily explained. In accordance with the model of variations, the further away a life track from another, the greater the differences in the script. Scientists are also perplexed by the movement patterns of a UFO. Instant acceleration, stop, sudden change in direction at a right angle. Taking inertness into account, a movement pattern like that is impossible. Besides, the inhabitants of these devices must experience huge overloads. From the standpoint of transurfing, there is nothing supernatural about this. Aliens do not experience any overloads at all because UFOs do not fly. Like our airplanes and space shuttles, most likely we are not observing the movement of an actual object itself, but of its realization in the space of variations. In matters concerning the soul and mind, there are also plenty of perplexing things. Material sciences images the world as a mechanical system. In other words, matter is principle and determines consciousness. In the light of recent achievements of the same science, this particular model is gradually losing its prestige. However, the change of models will happen again and again, if man falsely assumes that he can penetrate the actual essence of fundamental laws of nature. Equally well, a hen could phrase its conception of the creation, construction, and development of poultry farms. Man, in his intellectual evolution, is a step above the hen, but the infinite complexity of the world doesn't get closer. It is beyond man to know and understand everything there is. Let me repeat that. It is beyond man to know and understand everything there is. The pendulums of science and religion, laying claim to being the last instance of truth, have conquered their dominion not so much due to correct interpretation of the truth as to their persecution of dissidents. The constant hostility exists not only between the pendulums of science and religion in general, but also between separate branches within these pendulums. The battle doesn't stop. Yet this battle is not for the truth, but for adherence. When I was substantiating the mind's inability to store all information, I was basing my argument on the model of imaging information in terms of computer bytes. But this particular model could turn out to be completely incompatible with the neural activity of the brain. Who knows how this information is stored exactly? Imagine how a scientist coming from an age where there was no TV or radio would have gone about researching a TV or a radio. He would probably try to push buttons, take out various parts, and look for various changes on the display, not knowing how a TV works, and basing his conclusion on the result of his scientific observations. the scientists would have arrived at different conclusions, at the base of which would be one, seemingly an undeniable fact. A TV generates all TV shows on its own. They are born there, in these transistors and microcircuitries. In about the same way, the adherents of the mechanical model explore the human brain. Indeed, damage to certain areas of the brain has a predictable effect on perception and cognitive function. The operating principle of human intellect still remains unsolved. Nevertheless, the adherents of the mechanical model conclude that matter is what determines consciousness, and it cannot be any other way. Conservative followers of the mechanical model, proudly calling themselves scientists, hauntingly declare that they are doing genuine science, which is based on factual data and not on amateur speculations. Everything that doesn't fit the frame of the theory is declared to be anti-scientific and is not only rejected, but is subject to persecution. Fortunately, there are fewer and fewer scientists like that. You could argue against or agree with this. Just keep in mind that it is only a model. No one knows how it all really happens. Let me repeat that. No one knows how it all really happens. The mind has a tendency to reject things that do not fit the frame of sensible explanations. Let me repeat that. The mind has a tendency to reject things that do not fit the frame of sensible explanations. Until the mind has made sure the knowledge is reasonable, he won't let it into his worldview template. There is no doubt that transurfing works, but to be able to use it, you need to have at least some kind of explanation for your mind. The model of variations gives us an opportunity to feel the ground under our feet, but not more than that. It remains only a scheme. It could be transformed into another, more intricate model. For example, one could cast aside the assumption that there are so-called life tracks, which made it easier to understand in the beginning of the book. Then the space of variation goes from being discrete to being continuous. There are no longer any paths in the forest, there is just forest. However, that doesn't change the essence of transurfing. No matter what the model is, it will only more or less adequately reflect reality. The path of learning about reality is infinite, as the infinite ways in which reality may manifest itself. Let me repeat that. The path of learning about reality is infinite, as the infinite ways in which reality may manifest itself. Perhaps you will note to yourself that the principles of transurfing echo the principles of other similar teachings. There is nothing strange about that. Any teaching is relatively insular and represents a self-sufficient model. But to the extent that we are people with a more or less qualitatively similar worldview, the models too may have similar areas. It is pointless asking yourself the question, which of these models describes the world most adequately? The only thing that matters is what practical results could be gained from this or any other model. Take mathematics, for instance. Different branches of mathematics represent different models describing material realization. You could solve one and the same physics problem in several ways, applying different mathematical apparatuses. There is no point in arguing about what is better, analytical geometry or differential calculus. You can only choose what you like best, so go ahead and make your choice. End segment.